Hey everyone, welcome back. I just wanted to quickly go through our scoring guidelines for the FRQ workshop before you guys get a chance to go ahead and start grading one another. So real quick, our first term that we had was talking about habituation. Remember that habituation is kind of that really primitive form of learning. So you're demonstrating learning through habituation because you spend less time looking at something that uh, is old or that you've been adjusted to. So it shows that you have learned this stimulus. Same kind of thing with if you had noise in the background. So say that you have some kind of annoying construction going on in your neighborhood. At first, you notice it, then you become habituated to it. You're used to it, you're learning, and you kind of notice it less and less. So here with habituation, you want to say that the babies are demonstrating habituation because they're paying less attention to the shapes over time and repeated presentations of them. So as long as you're saying something along the lines of as the babies get older, they're habituated to the shapes because they're spending less time looking at them as they get older, that's good to go. You can't just say they became habituated to it. You need to explain what that means. So you need to say something along the lines of these children are showing habituation because they're looking at it less as they get older, basically because as they're getting older, they're seeing more repeated presentations of these shapes, most likely. So the novelty has worn off and they've become habituated to them. So next one was the mode. So you guys were identifying the mode for 3-month-old infants. So big thing here is I know with science and the ACT, I wouldn't read fully and I would mess myself up. So you're just looking at 3 months here, and mode is the most frequent number that pops up. So I think mode, most frequent. So here we see 15 pops up twice, so that's the mode because it's coming up most often. Then we have described the correlation between time and an infant's age. So we know that correlation is not causation, right? So if you find a correlation between, let's say, the infant's age and their ability to recognize shapes or habituation skills, uh, you can't say that it's causation because right here we're talking about correlation. There's just an association or a connection between those, but you can't say that age, the older you are, the better you are at recognizing shapes because that is a correlation, not a causation. So describe the correlation between time and an infant's age. Here, we want to talk kind of about the correlation coefficient. So is it a positive correlation or a negative or inverse correlation? So here we see that it is in fact a negative or inverse correlation because what you have to see is if it's positive, as age increased, the amount of time spent looking would also increase, right? It would be like a positive slope on a graph like this. What we see here, though, is actually a negative or inverse correlation because as the infant's ages increase, right, it's going up, we see a decrease in the time spent looking at an object, right? So it's inverse. They're going kind of in opposite directions. So it would be inverse or negative correlation, right? The slope would look kind of like this. It would be negative. So here, that would be a negative correlation. Then the next thing we looked at is the operational definition of the dependent variable. So remember, dependent variable is the thing that changes as a result of the experimenter changing the independent variable. So right, independent variable is what the researcher changes, and then dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. To find out what the independent and dependent variable are, I would ask myself, okay, what's the researcher changing? And then what's going to change as a result of that? So here we see Dr. Alleman expects that getting older will cause babies to recognize shapes faster. So he's going to change their age right? So he's using 3 months old, 5 6 months old, and then 5 8 month olds. So he's changing the age, and what he suspects is going to change as a result, dependent upon him changing that independent variable of age, will be the amount of time spent looking at the object. So dependent variable, again, would be the time spent looking. And if we're going to operationally define that, that's just how we're measuring that. So how are we measuring how long they're looking at this object, right? Because operational definition is being very specific in how you're measuring your variables. Because if someone were wanting to replicate that, you need to be very specific so they know exactly what to do when they're replicating it. Just like I did with my little demo at the beginning of the year with the PB&J. So, operational definition of dependent variable, which is time spent looking at that, be specific here and say even seconds. So, it would be operationally defined as the time an infant spends looking at the object measured in seconds. So, be very, very specific and precise there. Um, then we're talking about replication. So, what could he do? How could Dr. Alman use replication to conduct a better design study? So the big thing with being able to replicate, we said you need a good operational definition. So he has that, which is good. But other things that would be, if he were to replicate it again to make it even better, some things would be, there might be sampling bias, I would say, because he is using a very small sample size of just 3 months old, 5 6 months olds, and 5 8 month olds. So that's 15 kids. That's very small. And he knows the directors. So he's only using one daycare center out of the bajillion daycare centers in the country. So, if he were to use replication to conduct a better design study, I would say he could prevent that sampling bias from trying to use maybe random sampling and draw from daycare centers across the country to get a representative sample and have a larger sample size as well. Right, so larger sample size and sampling more daycare centers, and then within that, using random sampling would be good as well. With his hypothesis, so um, does the data support or not support his hypothesis? Well, at first glance, it looks like it does, right? Because the infants are spending less time looking at things as they get older. So it's therefore showing habituation, which is what he thought. We can't say that it proves his hypothesis because be really careful with what you're reading. He said that getting older will cause the babies to recognize shapes faster. Uh, this is correlational data, so you cannot prove cause and effect. So this, we can't use this to prove his hypothesis or support it because he's saying that it's causing. And again, this is just correlational. There could be a bunch of third variables or things like that that also might be causing this. So we cannot say that it supports this hypothesis, even if it looks like it does on paper, because it's correlational data, not an experiment. That's the only thing that you could use as an experiment to show causation. And then finally, suppose that Dr. Alaman covered the shape with a towel as the infant was exhibiting interest. Explain what would most likely be a key difference in the way that 3 month old infants would react towards this versus the way 8 month old infants would react. So, like I said, it was important with Piaget's different stages to know when those big moments happen, like object permanence, conservation, know what stage those happens in, and know around what ages those happen in, because you can tell here that, okay, so object permanence, a 3 month old wouldn't have object permanence, so they would still think that if you're playing peekaboo that you truly disappeared. An 8 month old would have object permanence because you memorize that. so they wouldn't think that you disappeared with peekaboo. So a big thing here, you need to say that 3 months old would likely lose interest when the shapes were covered with the towel because they don't have object permanence yet, so they think it disappeared. Whereas the 8-month-old would just pick up the towel because they realized it was hidden. So you need to explain how object permanence is developing, and the 3 months old don't have that yet, but the 8 months old do. All right. So one last thing, here we go, is just general considerations here. So we don't need unnecessary fluff in these research methods ones. You guys want to get in and get out. You don't need to define and provide an example of like what the independent variable is. So all you need to do is just go in, say what it is, but use full sentences. So make sure there's not too much unnecessary stuff here that's going to cause you trouble. Because on the actual FRQ and the AP exam, that's the research methods one, it's only going to be 15 minutes long. So you don't have time to be doing a whole long example and EA format for that. But also, you still need to write in full sentences for these. You shouldn't be just answering, mode bullet point 15. You need to write the mode for the 3 months old was 15. So make sure you're writing in full sentences, but you don't need a whole novel to be written for these either. All right. Good luck. Have fun today.